A lot of times Christianity, and the Catholic Church in particular, are seen as being enemies of freedom and diversity. Whereas in reality, the Church is the greatest advocate and arguably the greatest champion of both of these things. And this comes through in this really interesting story from the book of Numbers, chapter 11, involving the prophet Moses and two characters with really peculiar names, Eldad and Medad. And so basically, as a matter of background, in the book of Numbers, chapter 11, the prophet Moses is basically feeling overwhelmed. And so inspired by God, he goes on to appoint 70 elders who will assist him in the context of ministry. And so the plan basically is that these people will gather in the context of a meeting, a certain ritual would be performed, and then the Spirit would descend upon them and they would receive the gift of prophecy. And all that comes to pass, right? So all these guys receive the gift of prophecy by the grace of the Holy Spirit. But then what's interesting is that there's these two other guys, Eldad and Medad, and they weren't at the meeting, but they too received the gift of the Spirit. They too received the gift of prophecy, as a result of which people start complaining to the prophet Moses. In response to which Moses says what? Would that all people receive the gift of the Spirit? Would that all people receive the gift of prophecy? In other words, he's not scandalized by the fact that these people didn't attend the meeting or didn't follow the proper procedure, but instead he glorifies God that he has deemed it in his providence to give also to these guys the gift of the Spirit, the gift of prophecy for the good of the people of God. You find a similar thing going on in the Gospel, particularly the Gospel of Mark chapter 9. And so basically what you find in the context of the story is that the Apostle John complains to Jesus because someone else, apart from their group, is casting out demons, to which Jesus says what? Basically, he says two things. And so first of all, basically what he says is, no one who does a deed of power in my name can speak ill of me. But secondly, he says very provocatively, if someone is not against us, they're actually for us. Now, obviously, there's kind of a lot going on here, but perhaps we might distill both of these stories to a few basic principles. And so the first point is basically from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, point 1257, which basically goes like this. Even though the Catholic Church is the ordinary means by which God wishes to convey his grace and salvation to the world, whether we're talking about, for example, the liturgy, the sacraments, the magisterium, the priesthood, at the same time, God is not limited by these formal structures, but in fact can convey his grace and his salvation to the world by any and all means. And so to use an analogy to illustrate the point, obviously, as everyone knows, I'm a huge movie buff, but to be honest, I tend to not really like overtly religious films. There's obviously the occasional notable exception, like The Passion of Christ was pretty awesome. But at the same time, generally speaking, I tend to not like religious films because they tend to be too self-conscious. So it's not even a production value thing, right? The whole idea is that a lot of times it seems to be that the filmmakers, with regards to these overtly religious films, they tend to be, again, too self-conscious in terms of trying intentionally to place a certain message in the context of the film, and so it comes across as being somewhat clumsy and awkward. Whereas in contrast, I've found a lot of times that if filmmakers focus on simply making a good movie, without worrying about the political undertones or trying to convey a hidden message, if they just focus on making a good, beautiful movie, those movies, quite frankly, tend to be a lot more inspiring and moving in a really natural and organic sort of way. And I think the reason why is because these people in the second category of filmmakers, they tend to focus on good process, right? And so there's this kind of respectful dynamic of we're discovering the truth or discovering beauty, as opposed to simply presuming that just because I'm the artist, what I naturally produce is, in fact, good art. In any case, hopefully you see the point, right? And so you can have, for example, movies which aren't overtly religious, but at the same time have a greater religious sensibility in terms of leading people to rest in the good and the true and the beautiful, because the filmmaker in question is focused on making a quote-unquote good film. And if this filmmaker is respectful of the process and in fact is successful in terms of making a beautiful film, the beautiful film that he or she was meant to make, that film will be of the Lord and will lead people to Christ. Because of course any manifestation of beauty in this world is in fact a participation in Jesus Christ, who himself is beauty incarnate. In any case, at this point, perhaps I might kind of qualify everything we said kind of thus far, right? And so we're not advocating a sort of religious syncretism. We're not suggesting that there is no truth or saying that all religions are basically the same, because everything we said thus far presumes a certain authenticity and sincerity in terms of how one is living one's life. And so to illustrate the point, I want to draw upon this really interesting story from the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 19. And so basically in the context of this story, what you find is that there's a bunch of charlatans, 7 guys pretending to be legit exorcists. And so they're trying to make money by pretending to have the legitimate power to cast out demons. The only difficulty is that one day they actually encounter a man who's actually possessed by a legit demon. And so when they say to this demon, look, I cast you out in the name of Christ, preached by Paul, the demon basically says to them in return, I know Jesus and I know Paul, but who are you? And so they're like, uh-oh. And so as a result, they become possessed by this demon, and then they run away naked and wounded, and that's basically the end of the story. Now, you look at the story, obviously it's kind of funny, but it's also meant to kind of convey a point which is supporting everything we've been saying thus far, right? And so, again, everything we're saying thus far presumes a certain authenticity and sincerity. And so the reason why it didn't work for these guys in the Acts of the Apostles chapter 19 is because they lacked precisely that, sincerity and authenticity. They weren't trying to go the way of Christ. They were just trying to make a quick buck by pretending to be believers. Whereas in contrast, if you have guys like Eldad and Medad, or the guy from the Gospel of Mark who was casting out demons even though he's apart from the legitimate group, basically these guys, it's presumed, have sincerity and authenticity. And so the idea is that inevitably these people will eventually find the fullness of Christ because they're sincere, because they're trying to be authentic. And Bishop Barrett talks about this in terms of the three great transcendentals, the good, the true, and the beautiful. And so to use an analogy, let's say you're trying to get someone into baseball, right? There's different ways to approach it, right? So one can say the rules, so like the truth. One can start by throwing a ball around, so this idea of the good, participating in this thing. Or one can simply visit a Blue Jays game, for example, so the embodiment of the beautiful. But the whole point is that whether you start with the good, the true, or the beautiful, these things are mutually implicative, which is to say that regardless of what you start with, if you follow these things through with sincerity, with authenticity, eventually you'll come to rest in the other two, which means eventually you'll come to rest in Christ, who is the way, the truth, and the life, the good, the true, and the beautiful. But that leads us to our third and final point, right? And so the whole idea here is that any manifestation of the good and the true and the beautiful is of the Lord. And so even though these things might come to us in packages that we don't expect, we must rejoice in these things. We must recognize them, we must rejoice in them, as opposed to going away of resentment, bitterness, and envy, because these things, again, are of the Lord. As you probably know, back in the day, before I became a priest, I was a lawyer. And I'll always remember my first day of working at a particular law firm. I went up to this lawyer, for whom I would work primarily, with a certain expectation. Not with a sense of fear or trepidation, but with a certain expectation that he would tell me exactly what he wanted and how exactly he wanted this thing to be done. But instead, what he said to me was, just do your thing. Like, here's this task, here's this assignment. I know you've done this sort of thing before, and so let's just see what you got. And if I have comments, I'll make comments afterwards. And I remember when I heard that, I was kind of surprised, obviously, but then I took it to heart. I did the assignment, I brought it back to him. And certainly he had certain opinions as to what he might change kind of here and there. He had his own comments, but for the most part, he just kind of left it as it was. And so there was this underlying sense that even though you're solving the problem in a different way than perhaps I would solve it, it doesn't mean that your way is wrong. It just means that your way is different. And on top of that, I got the sense that he was so open to my particular way of solving the problem that he even changed his own process, even though he was the senior lawyer and I was the junior lawyer. And I have to admit, this whole experience really stayed with me. It really changed my life, actually. And it's something I would bring to bear when I myself became the pastor of my own parishes. And so, for example, I remember going through an extended period of time where I just did a ton of interviews looking for someone to fill a particular full-time position which was really important in the context of the parish. And I gotta admit, one particular reason why the selection process was so long was because a lot of the candidates brought to the table a certain kind of really narrow mentality. Look, tell me again what you want me to do and exactly how you want to do it. And I didn't want that. I really didn't want that. And I remember talking to a good friend of mine partway through the process, and basically what she said to me, just to kind of paraphrase, is like, look, the thing you're looking for, it's almost impossible to find. Most people in the workplace have precisely this sort of mentality that you kind of don't like. Tell me exactly what you want and exactly how you want me to do it. And so you're never going to find the thing that you're looking for. And I remember kind of pushing back in a way which was polite but still firm. And I remember saying to her, like, look, even though it might be difficult to find someone like this, I'm not going to create structures which encourage people to just be robots. It's really important that people learn to respect their own inherent dignity in the context of a parish structure, because that's what we're aspiring for in terms of building Christian community. Now, just to close off that particular story, we did eventually find someone that I liked who fit within our parish structure, so that took care of that, but hopefully you see the underlying point. And so the whole idea is that even though it's true that there is, in fact, right and wrong, true and false, and there is a corresponding need for people in positions of power and leadership to establish a common vision, common goals, common objectives. At the same time, within that space, there is meant to be flexibility, freedom, respect for the dignity of the human person, and all forms of legitimate diversity. And the underlying point is that whenever we set up communities in this way, whether we're talking about families, the workplace, or even parish communities, it's not just good for the individual involved, but it's good for us. It's good for the community at large. It's good for the church, and in fact, it's good for the world. And may God bless you all.